is Hayley Mitchell, and Hayley is across all of the Residential Tenancy Act changes that are going to affect all of us as landlords. So I'll invite Hayley up to speak first. Thanks, Hayley.
Thank you. Okay, so great turnout tonight. How many people here are landlords? How many people are tenants? One. How many people are landlords and tenants? Ah, there you go. It's very interesting, some of the changes that are coming in. So before I start, there's only 3 changes that are currently in place now. Okay, everything else is going to come in on the 1st of July 2020, and it may not be exactly how you see it tonight because the bill has been written, the legislation has not. So there could still be a few changes, but I think it's a very good guideline as to what's coming. Okay, so we'll get through it as quickly as we can for you because I know not everyone loves legislation as much as I do, and I absolutely love it. So when they said this was coming out, I sat at home with the bill and spent 2 weeks deciphering it, and that for me was fun. Right, my husband works at home with me and he hated me for those 2 weeks. I'm like, oh my gosh, you should see this. And he's like, shut up. But I really do love it and I really get excited about it. And I see it as being positive change to the industry as much as possible. Now, there's going to be a few, I guess, harder or trickier things for us, but I think for the most part, it's going to really clean up the industry and lift the standards of agents, landlords and tenants, okay? I am going to show you the more negative ones tonight that would have more of a detrimental effect to landlords because they're the things that I guess are going to affect you the most, okay? But there are positives in it as well. So don't walk out of here and go, that's it. I'm going to speak to the guys and sell my property. This is terrible. It's not going to be that bad, I promise you. But there is going to be 130 changes and they want to make sure that whilst creating these reforms, landlords and owners, landlords and agents can still effectively manage the properties, but tenants also have rights as well. A lot of owners do think it's very one-sided on behalf of tenants. What do you guys think from what you've sort of heard in the marketplace? Apart from the one tenant who's a landlord. So you equal out anyway. I personally do think it's a little bit more pro-tenant than pro-landlord, okay? And that's just my personal opinion. I also think the current legislation sways more in the tenant's favour than the landlord's favour at the moment, okay? But again, personal opinion. So Consumer Affairs will oversee the implementation of the new laws. They're going to come into effect progressively with all of them in by the 1st of July 2020. And obviously, Residential Tenancies Act is the main source of protection for tenants and owners at the moment. So they did a review timeline and it started in 2015. In 2018, I was away for work and one of my friends that does a lot of work with the REIV called me and said, you're about to get really busy, the legislation's going through Parliament. And I said, great, but they're not going to vote on it for a couple of months. She said, yeah, we'll probably get an answer in, weeks, months, who knows. We had an answer in, I think it was 24 or 48 hours. And it went through 17 to 21 with no amendments. So exactly how it went through is how it got passed. There were more than 4,800 public comments. So what they did is they went out to the marketplace and they said to owners, to agents, to tenants, tenant support workers, tenants union, anyone who was affected by property, what would you like to see change in the legislation? And they had more than 4,800 comments around what the public wanted to see. Some of the things that us as property managers wanted did get in, and some of the things that we didn't want changed, got changed, okay? So the main outcomes, animals are going to be allowed to be kept in rented premises. How do you guys feel about that? Not good. So we don't know a lot of the obligations, I guess, around how animals can be kept in properties. Can they be outside? Can they be inside? Can they be flea treated? Can you put special conditions? We don't know. But the animal one is quite a process. So it actually puts the responsibility back on the tenant for doing the right thing and disclosing the animal, which at the moment There's no disclosure. Animals are totally silent in current legislation. I personally don't have a massive problem with the animal one. Allowing renters to make prescribed minor modifications to the rented premises, that could be a concern depending on what the list of prescribed items is. The next one is bolstering the security of tenure. So what they're going to do is they're going to remove the 120-day no reason notice. So at the moment as agents, we've got a notice that we can serve on a tenant saying in 120 days, we want you to move out. Now they're protected under a lease term, it's when they're periodic. They're going to remove that notice. And the reason they're going to remove that notice is they know that we never kick out a perfect tenant. There's always an underlying reason why you're going to use that notice. So therefore they're removing it. What they're also doing is they're restricting my favourite notice, which is our 90-day end of fixed term tenancy notice, which says at the end of your fixed term, I want you to move out. Okay? What they're going to do is they're going to restrict that to the first term only. So once a tenant goes past the initial lease term, that notice can no longer be used. So what do you think that effect will have? What do you reckon owners will start doing?
Giving them the notice.
Giving them the notice at the first term. So what they've tried to do is bolster the security of tenure by restricting that notice. But what us as agents and owners are going to do is say, hey, if I don't have a perfect tenant in the first 12 months, I'm going to move them out. And that's what we're actually recommending our clients to do at the moment. Okay, so there's those ones which I think are probably going to have the biggest effect on it. What that means is if you have a tenant that takes you, the owner, to VCAT, and it's probably around maintenance. So the tenant reports maintenance to you, you don't do it to a satisfactory standard or you don't do it at all. The tenant takes you to VCAT. You will go on what's called a non-compliance register, which means it's a public register that anyone can search to find a list of properties or owners or agents, because we go on it with you, who they don't want to rent through. Okay, so my suggestion is to avoid going on there, make sure you do your maintenance. Make sure you don't get in a situation where a tenant can take you to VCAT and therefore you'll never go on there. So what they're trying to do is clean up a lot of those slumlords, you know, especially around those rooming houses and those sort of properties where they don't maintain their properties for tenants. So if you're looking after your property, it's maintained, you look after a tenant, you'll never end up there. So it's not such a scary thing. Providing for the early release of bonds with the consent of both parties to a tenancy agreement. So basically before a tenant vacates the premises, they can ask for their bond back. So as an owner, would you let a tenant have their bond back before they move out? No. All you have to do is say no. If you're going to advertise the property at a fixed amount, you can't ask a tenant to pay you more, right? Completely fair enough. I completely understand that one. Providing for yearly instead of 6 monthly rent increases, that's in now. That was one of our early changes, so you can only increase the rent every 12 months now. I personally don't have a problem with that because really the market doesn't shift that quickly in 6-month increments, so it's not so bad. Providing for faster reimbursement where tenants have paid for urgent repairs. So you're going to have to reimburse a tenant within 7 days if they organise urgent repairs. So for example, hot water service blows up on a Saturday. Tenant organises someone to come out and replace it. You'll need to reimburse the tenant within 7 days. It's currently 14 days. Okay. Increasing the number of properties to which a statutory maximum cap of 4 weeks for bond and rent in advance applies. So what I mean by that is, at the moment, any rents which are over $351 a week, you can take a higher bond. Under the new legislation, it's going to be twice the median rent for Victoria, which currently stands at $760 a week. Now, when you look at it, in 1997, our legislation was written, and $350 a week in rent got you a big house. Nowadays, it doesn't in so many cases. So what they've done is just brought that in line with inflation, okay? Enabling automatic bond repayments, which will be available to the renter within 14 days. So basically, tenant moves out of a property, they apply for their bond back. If you don't dispute it in 14 days by applying to VCAT, the bond will automatically go back to the tenant. Okay? Requiring mandatory pre-contractual disclosure of material facts such as an intention to sell the property and the known presence of asbestos. That will be really interesting. They haven't really given us guidelines around that because as property managers and as owners, you're not going to know necessarily if your property has asbestos, are you? In Perth, when they changed the legislation, they made owners, if a property was built within a certain time period, they had to get building inspections done. And then that was then a disclosure in their act. I don't know what level we're going to go to with that one. Prohibiting misleading or deceptive conduct, inducing someone into entering into a tenancy agreement. So you can't say my property has high-speed internet when it doesn't. Which the fact they've put it in means that someone's actually doing that, which is really concerning. And allowing 5-year leases under Residential Tenancies Act. So that it wasn't allowed, it is now. So that was one of the early changes as well. So 5-year fixed term leases are now allowable under Residential Tenancies Act. The change with that one is if we are going to do a 5-year fixed term lease, you have to use a new standard lease agreement. So you can't just use the current lease agreement that we've been using for all of our properties. You have to use the new one which is created by CAV, which we can download now. Who here wants to...
If someone requested a 5-year lease, do you have to give
No, absolutely not. So who here would like to lock in a tenant for 5 years? No. Because what if you want to sell it? What if you want to move into it? What if you end up with a really bad tenant? Then you're stuck with them for 5 years. So my recommendation will be, don't do it. And I don't think tenants necessarily want to lock themselves in for 5 years either. Okay, so a couple of things. The next slide is you guys are going to have a name change. So owners and landlords are going to be called Residential Rental Providers, RRPs. Okay? So get your head around that one. I'm going to fluctuate between owners and landlords tonight because I have not got my head around RRPs. Tenants are going to be called renters, okay? Which I actually think sounds a little bit derogatory. I think tenants is much better. I don't know why they wanted to change it, but they do. And the tenancy agreement is going to be called the Residential Rental Agreement. So they're your main wording changes across the legislation. The other big change across the legislation, and this is a compliance thing, is they've increased the penalty units significantly. And what I mean by that is, if I own a milk bar and I sell cigarettes to a minor, so someone under the age of 18, it's a 4 penalty unit fine, and 1 penalty unit is currently equal to $165.22. Okay, so as we go through the legislation, you'll see the massive change in the increase in the penalty units. Urgent repairs change. So air conditioning is going to become an urgent repair. What I mean by that, you don't have to put in an air conditioner. However, if your property has an air conditioner, it will be an urgent repair to fix if it breaks down. So who here has air conditioning in their property? Rightio. So we've just got to make sure as property managers that our tradies are aware that they have to fix things a lot quicker because air conditioners getting a tradie out in the first heat wave, good luck. Failure to comply with rental minimum standards. So every property in Victoria is going to have to adhere to rental minimum standards. They are not onerous. Does anyone want to have a guess what they might be? There's about 8 of them. What was that? Someone say electricity or something? It's not a minimum standard, but it's, yes, would be required. Has to have adequate hot and cold water in the kitchen, bathroom and laundry. Yes, has to be secure. Yep. They are a requirement, but not under a minimum standard, but under a building regulation. Yep. Heating. Yes, so it's going to have functioning heater in the main living area. So if you have a property that doesn't have a functioning heater in the main living area, you will need to put one in. What else? What was that? Cooling. No, not cooling. TV. Nope, not TV. cooking, so oven, cooktop, food preparation area and sink. Yep, there's about 3 more. Toilet, yes. No one ever says toilet. I'm like, it's just the one thing that everyone needs. What was that last one? Someone said? Bathroom, adequate hot and cold water in the kitchen, bathroom, laundry. Has to have window furnishings in the main living area and any room that could potentially be used as a bedroom. So if you have a study, which could be converted to a nursery, for example, will have to have window furnishings as well. And the other one that's on there that I don't know what they mean is a vermin-proof bin. So I'm not sure whether that's a council bin with a lid outside or whether we've got to go to Bunnings and buy everyone little kitchen bins and pop them in the kitchen. I don't think that's the case. I think it'll be a council bin with a lid. But weird. That's weird. I don't understand. Again, these things might change as owners or residential rental providers. You will be given a period of time to bring your properties up to scratch. So they're not going to say 1st of July 2020, you have to have it. But if your property becomes vacant after the 1st of July 2020 and you're going to advertise it, you'll need to adhere to the standards then. But I don't think any of those are too onerous. A while ago, though, a lot of people talk about fly screens, for example, and that sort of thing. None of that got in. They're pretty minimum standards, so I'm actually not too concerned about them. Failure or breakdown of safety-related devices, including smoke alarm or pool fence, I think that's great. You guys obviously use Detector Inspector. I've used them in the past as well. They're excellent. They do a really good job and they take the full responsibility off you as a landlord. So for the annual servicing fee that you pay, it's just worth just getting it done, not having to worry about it. The other thing is fault or damage that makes the premises unsafe or insecure, including the presence of mould or damp caused by or related to the building structure. So if we're talking that there's got an exhaust fan in the bathroom and the tenant doesn't turn it on when they shower and there's a little bit of mould on the ceiling, that's not your responsibility. It's not an urgent repair. However, if you have a roof leak that's then caused the mould, that's obviously your urgent repair to fix. And the other one is a pest infestation, which is interesting because most of the pests are actually caused by the tenant. But you never know. Sometimes there can be a plague of mice or something like that where it's not a tenant's responsibility. I've got a cat at home who likes to bring the mice in and let them go to play with them later. So I had a pest problem for a while, but it was caused by my cat who liked to play with the mice and bring them inside. Disclosure before entering into residential agreement. If you've signed a contract of sale or, if you've organised a contract of sale or signed an authority with a selling agent and you're also putting the property on the rental market, you need to disclose that to a tenant at the start of a tenancy. Okay? And the reason for that is they don't want a tenant to move into a property and a week later have to go through a sale campaign. And I get that. Okay? If a mortgagee's commenced the proceeding, you need to disclose. If you're not the legal owner of a property, i.e. you might have parents that have moved into a retirement home and you're the power of attorney controlling the finances, you'd need to disclose that as well. And if a property is part of an electricity network that's embedded, so if you buy a new development, we need to disclose that. And any prescribed information such as the property has asbestos. Okay? So there's a few disclosure things which are new. I left this slide in because I want you to see the penalty units. Remembering if I own a milk bar and I sell tobacco to a child, it's a 4 penalty unit fine. If you rent a property not for a fixed rental amount, so a range or say offers over 300, as they do in sales but not in rentals, it's nearly a $10,000 fine. Right, so there's a difference. I don't get it, but anyway. The other thing is down here, if you have, so say we do an open for inspection and your property's super popular and 10 people come through. And at the open for inspection, someone comes up to Kathy and says, I really love this property, how do I get it? Kathy can't turn around to them and say, just offer an extra $10 a week to secure the property, to make your application more enticing to the landlord. However, if our tenant comes up to Kathy and says, hey Kathy, I want to put an extra $10 on my application because I really, really want to secure this property, you can absolutely accept it because you haven't asked for it. Okay, so you just got to be very careful. Kathy can't then go back to other applicants and say, I've received a higher offer for this property, would you like to match it? Okay, so they're clamping down on that one. It's all in the wording. If you have a 3-bedroom house, you will have to give 3 sets of keys to tenants to access and enjoy. So, for example, if you have a 3-bedroom house and 2 tenants sign the lease, you only need to give 2 keys. But if you have 3 named tenants on the lease, you'll need to give 3 lots of keys. Okay? It's a practice I've done anyway throughout my career, but just be aware if you're handing on a new property to Kathy, make sure you give her enough sets of keys for the amount of tenants that are going to take the property. Renter or visitor must not damage common areas or the property. So basically what this means is it's written a little bit better than what it's written now. And it also talks about fair wear and tear. So say you've got a brand new unit. It's a 2-bedder. You've moved in a couple. At the end of 12 months, how would you expect that brand new unit to come back to you? Pretty good? So what sort of wear and tear would you think would be reasonable in that case?
The carpet would be probably, the wear and tear on the carpet.
Yep, so some furniture dents and maybe a little bit of,
Scratches, I suppose, on the floor.
Yeah. So a little bit of wear and tear. So what the reason why they're putting the explanation about what fair wear and tear is a lot of landlords expect they've got a property, they lease it out for 5 years and then they're upset because there's this tiny mark on the wall. Like, you've got to be reasonable. There's wear and tear in your own home, there's wear and tear in your rental property. So they are trying to make it a little bit clearer about some of those things like fair wear and tear. Okay, so just be aware of that. So if your agent comes back to you and says, it really is fair wear and tear, they've been there for a few years, there's a couple of little scuffs and marks, it is. That's what fair wear and tear is. This one's an interesting one too, and I left this one in because the challenge that we as agents have with reasonably clean. So there's different versions of reasonably clean. There's a reasonably clean for a tenant, which if you go to VCAT is at this level, and there's a reasonably clean for what you as an owner need to hand over to a tenant, which is up at this level. Does everyone get that? So we've been to VCAT so many times and the VCAT member just says, do you know what? All the tenant needs to do to return a property to you guys or to the agent at the end of a tenancy is give it what we call a Saturday morning wipe down or a quick spring clean that they'd be doing throughout a midweek, when they're doing a quick clean, and then walk out the door. The reason I'm telling you this is I went to VCAT a month ago and that's exactly what the member said to the property manager up before me. And that's the way they view it. So we always try and bluff a tenant into bringing a property back up to this standard, but we know that really if it goes to VCAT, we're going to get it back to this standard and they expect an owner to pay the difference. That's the way it is. Right? So if your property manager says, I'll do as much as I can to get it done, they will, but sometimes your hands are tied and you're just not going to get it. And it's not worth going to VCAT for cleaning, for example. Has anyone found that at VCAT? They're really shocked that they didn't get enough money out of a tenant or anything like that. Yeah, the property manager's like, yep. I actually won a VCAT last week because, about a month ago, I got everything I asked for because when you can't prove smell in a property. It's the hardest thing to prove at VCAT. And I said I can't prove the smell to you, but I can tell you we had to get the carpet steam cleaned 3 times because the animal smell in the property was so extreme. And she goes, yeah, but you can't prove that. I said, I know I can't, but I said, here's a photo of my property manager's leg covered in fleas, which proves the kind of condition that the property came back. And she goes, yep, I'll pay that. I'm like, yes. I had to keep that photo forever. And you said, no, not really, because that would be fraudulent, but try and go down that path. If you have fleas in a property, get the photos of the fleas. So yeah, you've got to make sure that the property's in a reasonably clean condition, but there's different levels for different people. Modifications. So a tenant's going to be able to make prescribed minor modifications without the owner's consent. The only problem is we don't have a list of what those prescribed modifications are. What do you think they might be, potentially?
Photos.
Picture hooks, photos, yep. What else?
Second story extension?
Yeah, look, potentially. Maybe. If they do it properly and it increases the value of a property, let's go with it. That's the trouble, right? We actually don't know. I think it will be around safety-related things such as, has anyone here got kids? So bookshelves, IKEA units where you put them up against the wall and then a kid climbs them. So anything that needs to be secured to the wall for safety-related things, I think might be allowed. Things like shelving units, picture hooks, could be TV brackets as well because they're a risk if a child grabs them. But we just don't know. And until we get the list, I don't know whether we need to be worried about it. If a tenant does do something though, they need to restore it back to original condition subject to fair wear and tear, to a tradesman-like manner, because everyone's a tradie. Couple of things here, that anything else they can't do to the property without your written consent. Now, there's a few things here. An owner must not unreasonably refuse consent to modifications that do not penetrate or permanently modify surfaces, fixtures, structure required for health and safety, equal opportunity, or are needed by an occupational therapist, so rails in bathrooms and wheelchair ramps and that sort of thing. Ensure access to telecommunication, reasonable security measures. Increase the thermal comfort of the premises and reduce energy and water costs. However, an owner may be able to say no if there's an imminent change of ownership of the property or the owner's intending to move in, if there's extra modifications required to other property or common areas, if it would be additional maintenance costs for you guys in the future, and I'll give you some examples, or any restoration works would not be reasonable in this situation. It does say though that you can take a top-up bond, which is great because at the moment we can't take a top-up bond. So say your tenant says to you, I want to put in a split system unit up here. It will increase the thermal comfort of my property and I will pay for it. You could turn around to a tenant and say, okay, I actually don't want a split system unit here because if you leave it in the property, it's going to be additional maintenance costs for me in the future. You might also say that it's not reasonable to restore the premises back to original condition because of the type of plaster work or the style of property as well. So therefore that could be a right for you to say no. Or you could say to a tenant, well, yes, you can do it, but at the end of the tenancy when you move, if you don't remove that item and restore it to original condition, that will cost me $1,000, for example. So you can say to a tenant, you can do it, you have to remove it and restore it. If you don't remove it and restore it, I will use that $1,000 that you paid me, that you've topped up the bond with, to restore that back to original condition. So I don't hate it so much as long as the prescribed list of items is reasonable, because you can't say no to them. Does everyone get that? Do you hate it? Or not as bad as what? The fact that we can take a bond, I'm actually quite comfortable with. So duty, this is the one I said before, that the premises have to be vacant and reasonably clean for a new tenant to move into, and it's going from 0 penalty units, so there's currently been no fine associated with this section, to 60 penalty units or nearly $10,000. So if your property manager says, I've got a quick change between tenancies, I've got 3 days to get the property fit for the next tenant, and I require extra cleaning to be done, just let them pay for the $100 clean. Just get it done and work out the cost or who pays for it later, meaning you or the tenant, because you want to make sure that you're handing over the property in a reasonably clean condition for the next tenant. We also need to make sure we leave enough wiggle room in between tenancies. So we try and usually do a quick change of a couple of days to a week for an old tenant move out, new tenant move in. Sometimes we need to leave a bit extra wiggle room just to make sure that we don't breach this provision of the Act. So this is your minimum standards. These are the ones I said before. You need to make sure that on a day that a tenant takes occupation of the premises, it adheres to these minimum standards. If it doesn't, potential of a $10,000 fine and urgent repair to fix. Okay, so you've got to do it anyway. Yes?
Could you just maybe explain their functioning latches? Is that a lock?
No. So when you read they've written the bill, and then the Consumer Affairs Victoria have written a list of reforms as well. They talk about functioning latches on windows, meaning you can't access the property from outside. They also put in the CAV reform, they don't recommend putting windows with locks and keys because it's a fire risk and people can't get out. So it's got to be secured from external access. However, they don't recommend locks with keys, which is funny because most insurance policies want locks with keys. So it'll be very interesting to see how that one plays out when the legislation actually gets created, because it's kind of, it doesn't make sense at the moment. But yeah, great question. Maintain the premises. It is a landlord's responsibility to maintain the premises. If you want to have some light reading, Google this, Shields versus, it is light reading, there's quite a lot of information on it. You don't have to read the whole Supreme Court case, but basically what happens is, if we go to VCAT and we're not happy about a decision that's been made, we can challenge it at the Supreme Court on a question of law or the evidence of a member failing to provide a course of natural justice, okay? To go to the Supreme Court is about $5,000 to $10,000. So you've got to be pretty sure that you've got a winnable case to go. In this particular case, a tenant took an owner, private landlord, to VCAT. A private landlord was one of those slumlords. The property was not well maintained, had rats, it had water leaks, it had mould, you name it, it had it. It was pretty much falling down from all accounts. The tenant was, however, paying a cheap rent for that property, and she was completely aware of the disrepair when she signed up for the property. She remained in occupation for 5 years. At the end of a 5-year period, she took the landlord to VCAT for not maintaining the premises. VCAT said, you're aware of the disrepair when you moved in, you were paying a lesser rent and you stayed there for 5 years, therefore, landlord was not in breach. Landlord won. Fantastic. Tenant then took it to Supreme Court. The owner, private landlord, did not have representation. Supreme Court overturned the VCAT decision and then set a precedence back in our Act that regardless of the amount of rent being paid by the tenant, regardless of the fact that the tenant was aware of disrepair when they signed the tenancy, if there's something in that property that is not working, it has to be up to a reasonable standard. It's a landlord's duty to maintain. So for those landlords, for example, that might own an older style house and they rent it out whilst waiting for plans and permits, for example, or just are reluctant to spend money maintaining those properties, just be aware that a tenant can move in, paying a lesser rent, serve you with a repair notice, and you need to bring the property up to a reasonable standard. Okay? And it's in the Act now, but they're putting it in the new Act properly. So have a think about that if you do have properties which are the older style properties. Now, you might have a tenant that moves in and never cares and you get away with it, so to speak. But if a tenant's smart and they know, that's what they can do. It's going to be important to keep records of any gas and electrical safety checks, including smoke alarms. So there's a whole lot of stuff coming in for that. Recommendation under Energy Safe is get your gas heaters checked every 24 months, every 2 years, get your smoke alarms done every 12 months. So I know you guys use plumbers for your gas safety, that's fantastic. Detector Inspector will look after your smoke alarms, just get them done and then everyone is just covered, no issues. Locks, every property is going to have a working deadlock on the external doors, unless there's another security barrier preventing access. So if you have a timber door with a handle lock, and then you have a security door, like a screen door with a lock, you won't need to put a deadlock on. But if you have just a timber door with a handle lock just at the front of the house, it can be accessed from the street, you'll need to put on a deadlock. But just wait on this because there could be some more restrictions or changes. So I wouldn't go out and spend the money now, but just be aware you might have to upgrade your lock-in system when it comes in. Your locksmiths, anyone a locksmith here? You're going to make money, so it's good for them. for your trades. All right, I'll get through pets. There's 5 sections, actually 6 if you include how to vacate them at the end. Wait till I get to the last bit before you ask me a question, because I'll hopefully answer it in the last bit. All right, so the first thing is a tenant. Oh, what does everyone know about how the Act relates to pets at the moment? Does anyone know what the rules are?
They can ask and you can't reasonably refuse.
What's that? Get approval, yeah. What's that?
You can't reasonably refuse.
Yeah, do you know the Act is completely silent on pets? Completely silent. So basically, if a tenant gets a pet and the pet isn't causing a nuisance or damage or endangering the safety of neighbours, we actually can't do anything about it. So they can lie on their application, say no pets, they can move into the property, say no pets, and then we find out they've got a little white fluffy dog. Nothing we can do about it. So at least with the new legislation, there's a whole lot of responsibility going back on tenants to actually do the right thing and ask for the pet. And I would be saying to owners that if a tenant comes forward and discloses the pet, you know what you're going to get, rather than the tenant that says they don't have one and then have 3. Okay? So I'll run through it. First thing is, a tenant may keep a pet at the rented premises with the consent of the owner in writing, or an order from VCAT saying yes to a pet. They're the only 2 reasons. They can't just get a pet because they want a pet. Consent of owner in writing or a VCAT order saying yes. A renter who requests the permission of the owner to keep the pet has to do so in a form approved by the Director of Consumer Affairs Victoria. So basically, Consumer Affairs Victoria are going to create a pet application form. Tenant must fill that out and hand it to the owner. The owner must not unreasonably refuse consent to the pet. Okay? The other thing is, it's deemed automatic consent if you don't act within 14 days. So a tenant walks into the office, hands Kathy a pet application form. Kathy goes on, now this wouldn't happen by the way in this office, but Kathy goes on holidays, goes into her in-tray, she comes back a month later, totally refreshed, gets it out of the in-tray, it's automatic consent because she hasn't acted in 14 days. Okay? In order to say no to that pet, you actually have to go to VCAT to say no. Okay, so Kathy can't turn around and say the owner doesn't want a pet. No, you have to apply to VCAT within 14 days to say no to the pet. Okay? So if someone calls you and says, I've got a pet application, don't go, oh, I'll think about it. Give them an answer. The owner may apply, or owner or agent may apply to tribunal for an order saying it's reasonable for them to say no to the pet. We can also apply to the tribunal to exclude the pet if the tenant's keeping a sneaky pet. So we go to a routine inspection and we know that there's a dog there but we can't prove it, then you can apply to VCAT to actually get the pet removed because they haven't followed due process. Now we don't have that at the moment. They'll look at things like the age of the property, the characteristics of the property, the type of pet that the tenant is proposing to keep or is keeping, whether refusing consent to keep the pet is permitted under any act. They'll look at things like if a dog is required for therapy, like therapy support for a tenant. You have therapy pets at the moment. I can tell you if you have a tenant with a legitimate therapy pet, those dogs are about $70,000. They're going to be very well looked after pets, I can guarantee it. But, you know, doctor's certificate may potentially trump if they say, you know, I need this for anxiety or anything like that. If a tribunal makes an order excluding the pet from the property, they'll give a date in which a pet has to be removed. So it's not cancelling the tenant from the property, it's cancelling the pet from the tenancy. Okay? If the tenant does not follow the order and still keeps the pet in the property, it's a 28-day notice to vacate to the tenant. So there's a process. It's not just that the tenant can just get a pet and have the pet live there. They've got to follow due process. Now, if they had have said you can take a higher bond for a pet, I would have been a lot more comfortable. They haven't put a bond provision in for a pet though. And they haven't said whether or not the pet has to be outside or inside, whether you have to fumigate carpets, whether extra cleaning's required. We've got none of that yet. So we're just going to have to wait and see how it plays out. But for the most part, it's better than what we have now, which is nothing. Hey? Yes?
Would the tenant or landlord then have to provide security to prevent any of that dog escaping?
Good question. Would the tenant or landlord have to provide security for the dog escaping? I would say that you're leasing the property as is. If they require extra fencing or something, it goes back on them because they've inspected the property and they've worked out that that's suitable for that particular animal. Then if they want to upgrade, that would be at their cost. But I don't know how it will play out. Yeah, because you can't say no to it. So it's not like they can turn around and say, you've got to put in your $5,000 fence to keep in the dog that you didn't want.
It'd come under the minor modifications.
Potentially minor modifications, yeah. It's not as bad as how it was sprouted though in the when there was the election campaign and there Chris Brown, you know, Bondi vets on there saying everyone can have a pet and all this sort of stuff. It's not as bad as that. There are responsibilities that go back to all parties as well. I'm really interested to see how this one plays out. Very interested. And it's going to be challenged at VCAT very quickly. I can pretty much guarantee on the 1st of July 2020, us agents are going to end up with pet application forms on their desk.
So are they talking singular pet or multiple pets?
Don't know. You've got to apply for each pet individually. It'll come back to council guidelines. So if council allows 2 dogs, you're allowed 2 dogs. But it will depend on the property as well. So I've got a property I own in South Yarra and it's a 1-bedroom flat, and I had some applicants a couple of months ago. A professional couple with a French bulldog, you know, those really expensive ones. And then a couple that have just moved here from another country and they had no rental history, and I went with the couple and the dog because I just went, do you know what? In a year's time, I can't say no anyway. They had rental history for the dog. They provided me with a cover letter for the dog's application with all his training history and his vet history and his microchip and a photo, and I just went, yeah, I'll take them. I know them, I trust them. The other people, no rental history, I'd rather leave that alone. So it just depends. And I've never allowed pets in my property before. I've had that property 12 years. So, yes?
Our property's a little bit rural, so we allow pets.
Yep.
We usually have issues, but I can just imagine it'd be quite difficult also for the tenant, because one tenant had guinea pigs, for example.
Oh, yeah.
And they breed quite rapidly.
And they smell bad.
Every time they have babies,
Yeah.
we would get like 10 forms.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, it'll be interesting. I don't know about guinea pigs. Yeah, very interesting. Are they outside though?
The guinea pigs were outside.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I have a...
Chicken, but like, small animals
Yep.
like chickens or whatever,
Yep.
come and go. Fox
Yep.
comes, they lose them.
Yep. I have 15 animals. A week ago I had 18. I had a few oldies, so it's just the way things work. But I have 15 animals, but I also live on a farm, so it's kind of reasonable. But yeah, I would hate to fill pet application forms in for every animal we change over.
So, I mean, I'm just, if someone, say, wanted chicken,
Yep.
could they put in a form that say, we would like up to 10 chickens? And then...
Oh, I think, yeah, look, I think so. In that case, probably yes. But again, it'll come back to council regulations and I don't know how the form's going to be filled out.
Like is it fucky and...
Yeah, no, the names and photos of all the different animals. Yeah, who knows? Who knows? Anyway, pets is really interesting. Okay, so entry of rented premises, this is changing a little bit. So currently the legislation says we can show through a prospective buyer or lender, or we can show through a prospective tenant. So technically the Act is not covered for open for inspections, which is the current practice that agents do now, whereas 20 years ago when the Act was written, we did private inspections, so it's very different. And look, different areas do different methods as well, but they're actually going to cover us for private leasing or OFI, which is fantastic. So it's just that wording change that'll make our jobs easier, but it's going to be a minimum of 48 hours notice. It's currently 24 hours notice. It's going to be a minimum of 7 days notice for advertising photos and videos. So you might think that that's extreme, but at the moment we're actually not covered under the Act. So if you have a tenant who's currently residing in a property and you want to sell the property and you want to get in for photos and videos and the tenant says no, it's really hard to find an entry provision which will cover you for that. So under the new one, yes, it's minimum 7 days, but you're allowed to do it. So I'm actually happy with that one. 24 hours notice for landlord duty, tenant failed to comply on family violence, exactly what it is now. And minimum 7 days for valuation and routine inspection. So if we want to do a routine, currently it's minimum 24 hours, it's going to minimum of 7 days. Gives them time to hide the extra dog and cats and chickens that they haven't given permission for. No, not really. I actually don't mind that. I would hate to be a tenant, have my agent go, hey, I'm going to be here in 24 hours to do an inspection. I much prefer to give my tenants a little bit longer to clean up, because my house isn't inspectable every day, I can tell you that, not with the amount of animals and kids I have. So yeah, I don't mind that. And valuation, just the sales agents need to know that subject to finance clauses could push out a little bit if we've got to wait minimum 7 days to get through for a val. Now, if we have an awesome tenant that says pops are at 12 o'clock tomorrow, no problem. But if we need to follow legislation to the T, this is what we've got to work with. They've given a few improvements for us though. So currently a tenant needs to give 28 days written notice when they want to vacate a premises, and we can show prospective tenants through in the last 14 days of that tenancy. With the new legislation, we'll be able to show tenants through in the last 21 days of the tenancy, up to twice a week. So we're going to be able to do 6 either private or open for inspections in the last 3 weeks of the tenancy. So that's much better than what we've got now. This one for sales, there's good and bad. So when you want to sell a property, we need to give a tenant 14 days notice of the proposed sale of a property. Okay, so it's not giving them notice to vacate, it's saying in 14 days, we're proposing access to sell the property. You have to agree with the tenants to go through up to twice a week unless otherwise agreed for a period of no longer than 1 hour for each sales inspection. You also will have to pay the tenant, you must pay the tenant the prescribed compensation per sales inspection. So every time that your sales agent is going through and showing someone through, you are paying prescribed compensation back to the tenant. Who wants to guess what the prescribed amount is? We don't know. Along with all the other prescribed stuff, they haven't told us yet. I think it'll be a percentage of the rent. Because I've had properties which have been $180 a week in rent up to $4,000 a week in the rent. You're not going to give $50 for this one and this one because it's just not relative to the amount of money that's been spent on the rent. I think it'll be a percentage. I don't know. And the word is you must pay the prescribed. So it's not a choice. It's not if you're asked, it says must. So we'll wait and see how that one plays out. What I'd say to you guys though, if you're selling your property and you want to get the tenant on side, to throw them a little bit of money can mean a lot of money in your back pocket if you've got a compliant tenant. So I've always recommended to owners to give them a little bit of compensation to sweeten the deal, because I've been a tenant and I've lived through a sale campaign and it's annoying. Okay? So it's not as bad, I don't think, depending what that prescribed amount is. Couple of things here. So depreciation's taken into account at VCAT. What I mean by that, and I think it's changed recently, but carpet was 10 years, and I looked at a new app last week and it said 8-year lifespan. So I think they've actually changed it, but I've got to double check with the ATO. So basically I'll go with the 10 years. If you have carpet that's 10 years old and the tenant moves into the property and the carpet's immaculate, you've lived there the whole time, don't know whether you had plastic wrap over it or whatever, but it's just immaculate. You never wore shoes on it, looks brand new. Tenant moves in, they're there for 12 months, they move out and the carpet's wrecked. You actually won't get a cent in compensation at VCAT because depreciation gets taken into account, and as far as VCAT's aware, that carpet has outlived its 10-year lifespan. Okay, so as agents, what we try and do is negotiate compensation, but we know if it goes to VCAT, we won't get any money for you. Okay, they're actually putting depreciation into the new Act for that reason. So currently it's been us telling you that. It'll be written into the new Act. The other part here is break lease. So if a tenant is going to break their lease mid-tenancy, You can charge a tenant a pro rata let fee, advertising and rent until the property is relet. Currently, that's silent in the Act, so everyone does something a little bit different. But this is a normal practice that they want us all to adhere to, so they're popping it in the Act. Okay, so pro rata let fee means if you pay, for example, a 2-week let fee to find a tenant and the tenant's there for half that period, they will pay 1 week's rent and you as an owner will pay the other week's rent. Okay, so they pro rata it. Termination by renter before possession. This is a new one here, does not meet rental minimum standards. So, Kathy shows through a property on a Saturday. On the Monday, the tenant applies for the property. You check the application, tenant's great. We approve the application, tenant signs the lease and pays the first month's rent or first fortnight's rent, whatever it might be, to secure the property. The property's then secured, ready for the tenant. They're due to move in on the Friday. On the Wednesday, they look back at the ad and realise that there's no heater in the main living area, therefore it doesn't adhere to minimum standards. They ring Kathy and they say, I no longer want the property, and they can walk away. However, if they don't realise, they collect the keys on the Friday to move in, they go to the property and then realise there's no heater, becomes an urgent repair to fix, plus the potential of a $10,000 fine if it goes to VCAT. Okay? Reduced period of notice of intention to vacate. The top one is the biggest one here. So if we want to kick out a tenant and we give them a 60-day notice to vacate for property sold, right? Property's been sold, it was sold on the 1st of March, end of lease is 15th of May, we give them a 60-day notice plus postage.
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, Siri. I don't even use Siri. Oh, now I talk to her and she's trying to talk to me. You give a notice to vacate for the 15th of May, and that's the end of that's where their lease ends. They can give you 14 days return notice back in March. Okay, so currently what we try and do is we hold a tenant to the end of lease date. And we can do that technically under our current legislation. But basically, as soon as you serve a 60-day notice to a tenant, they can give you 14 days return notice irrespective of end of lease date. So you may have a period of time where you're awaiting settlement where you're not having rent coming in on a property. And the way VCAT looks at that is you can't have your cake and eat it too. Okay, you want the tenant out, you can't dictate what date you want them to move. Okay? The other thing here is the renter's been given a notice of intention to sell, so that's a 14-day notice of intention to sell, but you didn't disclose the tenant of a proposed sale at the start because you didn't know about it. Okay, so it's only if you did it right at the very beginning of the lease. Damage, safety equipment such as smoke alarms, so it's whether by act or omission intentionally or recklessly causes serious damage to the premises. No longer includes the word malicious, which is awesome because trying to get malicious on insurance can be tricky at times. Insurance guy can probably talk about that anyway, but it's an immediate notice to vacate. So I did this session and the property manager said, I know how to get tenants out. I said, what's the loophole? I haven't found it. She said, I'm going to take a baseball bat to my routines. I'm going to smash off my smoke alarms, take a photo, say the tenant did it, then give immediate notice to vacate. I'm like, well, you can't technically do that, but yes, that would be something that if a tenant was going to smash off your smoke alarms, it could be an immediate notice to vacate. Safety-related device. Danger. Currently, we can only serve a notice to vacate on a tenant where they seriously endanger the life of a neighbour. Okay, so they have a dispute with the guy next door and they go around with a baseball bat and they threaten to kill him. That would be enough to serve an immediate notice to vacate. Doesn't actually protect you as owners or us as agents. Under the new legislation, it will protect agents and owners as well. So if a tenant comes into the office with a baseball bat trying to kill Kathy, immediate notice to vacate. All right? Whereas before, it's just an AVO and trying to go through the police to get them out. But they've got to be serious acts of violence. The next one is threats and intimidation. So if a tenant is seriously threatening or intimidating you, contractors and employees, so our tradies, the guys at the office, it's a 14-day notice to vacate. We've got nothing in our legislation at the moment that protects you as owners or us as agents or our contractors and employees, so I'm actually really happy with that. Okay? We've got to be able to prove it though, and luckily for us, a lot of people when they're communicating with us do so in writing. So we do often cop a little bit of abuse, and often it's because, you know, we're the middleman. You know, tenant wants something, owner wants something, we're the middleman, we're the bad person, we cop the abuse. If you have an agent that comes to you and says, I've got a situation where I can't work with this person, I'm seriously worried about my safety, let us kick them out, okay? Because as agents, you don't want to be going through that. Non-payment of rent, you're not going to like this one because I don't like this one, but I'll run through it anyway. Currently, if a tenant is late with rent, they've got to be 14 days late with rent. On the 15th day, we serve a notice to vacate. We then have to wait a week for the notice to be received or postal period, and then we can apply to VCAT. Okay, so basically by the time we apply to VCAT, the tenant is a minimum of 3 weeks late with rent. Under the new legislation, they're going to be given a 5 strike in every rolling 12-month period. So what I mean by that, tenant's 14 days late. On the 15th day, we serve a notice to vacate. They then have the postal period plus the notice period, which is 14 days to pay the rent. So an extra 21 days to pay the rent. If they pay the rent that's on the original notice in that 21-day period, 1 strike. No VCAT. You wait till the next month and do it again. So they're allowed to do that 4 times. On the 5th occasion of non-payment of rent in a rolling 12-month period, regardless if they pay the rent between the notice to vacate date and the termination date and the notice to vacate, you can get before VCAT, okay? VCAT will decide whether they give you possession, payment plan, send the tenant to financial counselling, or adjourn the hearing. So what my recommendation would be is you've got to have 3 months rent in the bank and you've got to have insurance. Okay? You insure your car that's worth 10 grand and so many people don't insure their properties and it doesn't make sense. So make sure you have adequate insurance for your property. For 99.9% of tenants, you never have this issue. My rent roll, I've got 1 tenant at the moment in arrears. That's it. So for a lot of these situations, you're never going to find that you get into it. But if a tenant does play the game, that's a game that they're allowed to play. And I don't think it's a great game. Yep.
So you said a rolling 12-month period.
Yeah.
So that means the following year it
Resets. Yep.
So they could technically be in
Yep.
that game
Yep.
half a year every year.
Yeah, pretty much. Yep. So my recommendation will be kick them out the first term. Yeah, basically what we're looking at. Yeah. Big penalty unit on this one. You can't lie to get a tenant out of a property, i.e. you can't say, I'm going to sell the property, get the tenant out, and then relet it. If you do, nearly $25,000 fine. Now, all you need to do is keep it vacant for 6 months from the date the notice was given. Remembering it's a 60-day notice to vacate plus postage. By the time the tenant moves out, they're already 2 and a bit months into that 6-month period. Leave it vacant for 3.5 months, go find another tenant, or go to VCAT to get the property cleared to be relet. But don't lie about your reasons to kick a tenant out. And the reason they've made that fine so big is that they're removing some of our other ways of getting tenants out. Okay? So be careful with that one. So what we can do now and in the future, we are going to have really, really stringent tenancy checks. Because once they move in, it's going to be harder to get them out. Okay, so we've got to make sure it'll be things like looking at past history, looking at tenant ledgers, looking at databases which we've got available to us as well. I Google stalk people which is something that I do. Look at Google, look at Facebook, look at, tenant groups on Facebook to see if they've made any derogatory comments or silly comments where you think, oh, they might be a bit dodgy. But we're going to have to really increase the way that we look at tenants. Landlords are going to have insurance to better protect themselves. It makes sense to have insurance. It's a couple $100 a year for landlords cover. Obviously, building insurance is different, but you've got an insurance person here that's going to give you some ideas about what you need to do. We've started doing longer term leases because under legislation, we can only go through in the 3rd month and the 9-month mark. So technically, if I wanted to kick out a tenant in the first 12-month period, I'm not going to be able to do my 2 routines and still have enough time to evict them at the end of fixed term. So what we've started to do is 14 and 15-month leases now to give us a longer trial period. You've started doing that now? Yeah, good. Yep, perfect. So what that means is we can do our 2 routines and still have enough time to get them out at the initial lease term when the new legislation comes in. That's awesome. Not many agents are doing that yet, and I'm like, just start doing it because it really will protect you. More tenants will be given notice to vacate at end of fixed term. If you don't have an absolute perfect tenant in the first 12 months, move them on, start again. Because once you go past the initial lease term, harder to get them out. Have practices that allow timely dealings with bonds, because if you don't have a timely dealing with the bond can disappear. Be prepared to go to VCAT more often, have longer wait times for hearings. So we wait a long time for VCAT. I don't know how long you guys are waiting out here, but you don't get a hearing straight away. So I think, especially in the early days, it's going to really push out our VCAT wait times. We may be able to rely on owners corporation rules saying no to pets. So if you're part of a common area property and it says no pets are allowed, you may be able to rely on those rules. However, I've heard that in Queensland that didn't work when they changed the legislation around pets. So we'll have to see how that one plays out. At the end of the day, we do just need to get on board and accept it. I'm personally a landlord, so I own investment properties. I have another agent manage them for me because I'm not in the city, I'm out Geelong way. But I also own a real estate agency as well. I'm actually not worried about changes. I think for the most part, everyone that does the right thing under the legislation at the moment is really not going to be affected. It's just going to be a change of process, a change of documentation, and a change of mindset. Okay, and the first 6 months will be tricky. And then when everyone starts getting used to it, it will even out. As landlords, you guys should not be worried about it. As a tenant, you should not be worried about it. Because if you're doing the right thing under legislation, it's really not going to change anything. It's just for those ones that play the game. It's going to take a while for us to work out how to play that game also. Any questions? You all look stunned. Is it more than you thought? Yeah, and that's only going through like 30 of them. There's 130 of them. I nearly know them all off by heart. Nearly. Told you I loved it. I get very excited. Any questions?
Get a tenant out.
Yeah.
You can say that one of your family members
Yep.
is moving in.
Yep.
So it's that simple if you really want to.
Yes, they have to be an immediate family member. Yeah. The other thing is when they've closed another loophole on us a little bit, in that when we serve a notice to vacate on a tenant, we're going to have to provide them with documentary evidence to accompany the notice to vacate, i.e. if you've got a family member moving in, say your parent, then you will have to provide a stat dec saying who that person is, and that will need to be served with the notice to vacate. So basically that's stopping you from just going serve it to get them out. Yeah. Then your family member would have to live there for 6 months, and then you can put it back on the rental market. So you can't use it primarily as a residence before that 6 month period from when the notice to vacate was given. Yeah.
But it is way.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Same with repairs, renovations, demolition, change of use. Like there's a whole lot of different things that you can do to get them out, and sale and sold and that sort of thing. Yep.
Does real estate agents have the capacity to know the history of previous renters if they have played the field, so to speak?
Yeah, there's databases that we can use. So National Tenancy Database and Ticker, and I never know what Ticker stands for, but yes, Ticker. NTD, yeah. So NTD and Ticker are the two big ones.
And the ledger.
And tenant ledger, yep. but it's reliant on agents lodging them. And you can only lodge them with a VCAT order, which is above the bond, or if they've abandoned the property. What I personally do if a tenant has a debt owed to me after a VCAT hearing is I lodge the tenant with the magistrate's court, because that shows up on the tenant's public record as a debt owed to my agency. So if a tenant then goes to get a loan or goes for another property, it'll show up on their public record. So that's a way where if someone did an NTD or ticker and looked up a public record, they'd be able to see that lodged and go, oh, they've rented off them. But yeah, you're a detective when you get these tenancy, when you get the applications in. The amount of stalking we do now, because we can, is quite a lot. That, yeah, we are limited in a few ways. Because the tenant can say that they're renting off mummy and daddy, and you ring the parents and they say yes, and really they could have been out doing the wrong thing and that agent hadn't put them on a database, potentially.
So there's no database that actually lines up saying that Joe Blow lived at this address?
No. No. Yep.
There was a penalty there for a renter who leaves property in poor state, I believe, somewhere amongst that.
No, that's a landlord who hands over a property that's not reasonably clean. I didn't put any penalties for tenants in this one.
No penalty for renters who leave the property in a poor state.
No. Nope.
One side.
Yep. Anything else? No? At least that cord worked, because I was getting a bit worried about that before. Yes, just flick over the cord to that one. That's my contact details. If you do have questions, I'm more than happy to help. But the guys here know exactly what's going on. They've been to my training. I'm travelling around Victoria doing a heap of this sort of stuff at the moment with landlords and property managers. So, as I said, I really like it. I think it's really interesting. So hopefully I haven't bored you all tonight and you've got a little bit of information from it. But that's it from me.